These asylum statistics are going to blow your mind. There's a new report out about asylum office approval rates, and I think you're going to be really surprised to see which office has the highest rejection rate. I'll tell you all about it. To do that, let's go over to my computer. Hey, if we're just now meeting, I'm Brian Manning. I'm a political asylum lawyer. I help people all over the country to secure their future in the United States through asylum. I used to be an asylum officer with the government, but now I'm an asylum lawyer, and I help people all over the country to get asylum. So, new report came out that I think is really interesting. I wanted to make this video to share with you some of the most interesting aspects. Okay, so surprising statistics from the asylum office. So we're talking today mainly about affirmative asylum cases, those cases where the person is not in deportation proceedings, rather is reaching out and applying affirmatively for asylum with USCIS, that's US Citizenship and Immigration Services. So this report is called Lives in Limbo, How the Boston Asylum Office Fails Asylum Seekers. And as the name suggests, it's focusing on Boston because you know how there's different asylum offices. One of them is in Boston. And the authors of this study, which are what you're seeing on the screen here, Maine University School of Law, ACLU Maine, Immigrant Legal Advocacy Project, and there was also another professor that was involved in it. They did a great job, by the way. Kudos to them for this really interesting report. Well, a lot of these folks are working frequently with applicants in the Boston Asylum Office, and they noticed that the refusal rates at Boston seem to be a lot higher than at other asylum offices, especially compared to Newark, New Jersey, where a lot of these folks doing the study had done work. And so they wanted to dig into it, and they talked to a bunch of people, a bunch of former asylum officers, a bunch of asylum applicants, and other people. And they also sued the government to get data because you see, the government doesn't give out much data about asylum, especially affirmative asylum cases. They pretty much stopped doing that in 2019. So some of the stats that we're going to see today are from a time frame that's 2016 to 2019, but there is an important stat or two that's more recent from 2021 that the authors of this study had to get by suing the government. They did a Freedom of Information Act request where they said, please give us this information that we're entitled to under the law, but then USCIS stonewalled. They didn't do it. And so these folks had to sue to get some of this information that we're going to talk about today. So thanks to them for doing that. So the national approval rate from 2015 to just, I think it's actually the very end of 2019 or close to the end of it, was 28%, meaning in all the asylum offices all over the country during this time frame, only 28% of affirmative asylum cases were approved. Now, this was pretty shocking to me because I used to be an asylum officer. And when I was an asylum officer, I was told that the approval rate was somewhere in like the 40s, 40% something, 40 something percent. But it turns out that at least over this longer period of time, that's not the case. It was really low, 28%. So less than a third of asylum cases got approved during this period. Now, check this out. It even went down, the approval rate went down a notch in the most recent year for which there was data, fiscal year 2021. Only 27% of cases nationwide for affirmative asylum were approved. All right, pretty low, pretty disappointing, and it really should not be that way, especially when you consider that the immigration courts have a much higher approval rate. Indeed, 40%. So in immigration court, the asylum approval rate was 40. And that's way higher than this 27 and 28% we're seeing from the asylum office. Why is that? Well, immigration judges are better usually than asylum officers. Asylum officers immigration judges are overwhelmed too with work, but they tend to be more sophisticated, better trained, and it's a more senior job. It's a harder job to get to be a judge than to be an asylum officer. So they're usually better at applying the law, applying the facts of the case to the law, and I think that's one of the main reasons that the asylum courts or the immigration courts have a much higher approval rate for asylum cases than the asylum office does. But it shouldn't be that way. There shouldn't be this huge gap between the two because the law is the law, right? And you're dealing with the same immigrant populations in both the asylum office and the court. So that can't be something that explains this difference. All right, here's what you came for. These numbers are Approval rates by asylum office from January 2016 to September 2019. So who has the highest approval rate? San Francisco. No surprise there. No surprise at all. One would assume that the places on the coasts would have a higher approval rate, right? They tend to be more liberal states and more liberal cities where these offices are located, and that's going to attract more sort of liberal, flexible, pro-immigrant officers who want to live there and work there. So, and also the law is more favorable, especially in California, where San Francisco is. Um, the laws change a little bit. There's some areas within asylum law that it makes a difference where your interview is being held, because the higher up courts and the federal courts treat certain issues differently, to where you may have a benefit by being in a certain area under the law. And that's the case with California. So no surprise there. But the shocker, absolute shocker to me, New York down here at the bottom. The lowest approval rate? Are you kidding me? I would have thought that it was San Francisco was the highest, followed by New York. But it was way off. San Francisco is way up there at 52% approval. New York is way down there at 10% approval, 10.6%. I don't know how to explain that. It's beyond me why New York would have such a low approval rate when there's just nothing in my mind to explain that. So, what else do we have here? We have New Orleans at 46%. That's surprising to me that they would have the second highest. I would have thought they'd be lower. Los Angeles, not surprising that it would be in third highest approval rate at 36%. Chicago's at 32.4%. Arlington, in Arlington, Virginia, near Washington, D.C., was a 27.1% approval rate. Houston, that's where I used to work, the Houston Asylum Office, 25.9%, which is lower than what I thought. I remember being told that the national approval rate was somewhere like in the 40s, and the Houston approval rate was a little bit lower in the 30s, but this shows that it was 25.9% approval, which is low. It shouldn't be that way. Newark, which is in New Jersey, and then Miami at 20% approval rate, 20.7. Not surprising. Miami has the reputation of being tough, being strict, and making a lot of denials. But Boston, surprised that they're that low. I would have thought they would have been one of the higher ones. And then shocked about New York. 10.6% of cases in New York approved. Are you kidding me? That's ridiculous. This is an interesting chart in the study that shows us they're trying to highlight the difference between the huge contrast in some cases between decisions from the Boston Asylum Office and the Newark, New Jersey Asylum Office. If you look at the top one, it says Angola. Only 2% of cases from Angola were approved. In Boston, however, 17% were approved in Newark. That's a big difference. It's a really big difference, but there's even bigger gaps. Let me see. So, okay, if you look at Burundi, it's a small country, so it's a small sample size. Like, they don't have that many people seeking asylum in the United States, so it's a small sample size, granted, but still only 26% approval in Boston and 83% approval in Newark. That's wild. That's bizarre. It shouldn't be that way. So this is not a list of like every country. It's just a handful that the authors of this study were trying to highlight as show that there's this huge discrepancy between Boston and Newark. But it's pretty interesting. So, the question is why? Why does this happen? Why is Boston lower than Newark and other offices? But for me, the more interesting question is why are the overall approval rates so low? And so the authors have these 5 theories, or they have 5 reasons that they point to in explaining why. Some of these are general about like why it's so low in general, or why it's lower than it should be, and then some of them, 1 or 2, are specific to why they think Boston is lower. So this one, and I'm going to comment briefly on these because I've seen all these in my experience as an asylum officer, and now as an asylum lawyer, I've seen all this stuff in action, and I want to comment on it. So, what are the reasons for the low approval rate? Outsized role of supervisory asylum officers, SAO, supervisory asylum officer. That's the boss of the asylum officer. So what the authors say, and I agree with this, is that the supervisors, they have a lot of influence over how cases get decided, and the supervisors tend to be more anti-immigrant. They tend to be people who favor denying and refusing the asylum cases rather than granting them because of the way that the culture is at USCIS. They, they tend to be the ones that get promoted from being asylum officers up to being supervisory asylum officers, or SAOs. And the thing is, asylum officers sort of bend to the will of their supervisors. Why? Multiple reasons, but a couple of big ones are that if you, as an asylum officer, make a decision and your supervisor, your SAO, disagrees with it, well, they send it back to you and they say, you got to fix this. And that's going to take time for you. It's going to be hard. You're going to spend a lot of time going back and revising your analysis, doing more research. You might have to re-interview the person or do an additional interview where they have to come back in. You have to talk to them for hours again and then do more research and more writing, more analysis. And that's hard. And asylum officers are already way overworked. So they've got a lot on their plates. And so it's easy for them to just go, you know what? My supervisor, he would probably want me, or she would probably want me to deny this case. They would deny it. They're going to expect me to deny it. I'm just going to deny it. I'm not going to fight it because then it's just going to create a lot more work for me. Or if it's a close call, if it's like it could go either way, officers are going to tend to err on the side of doing what their supervisor wants. So it's less work for the officer. Also, though, their jobs depend on their supervisor's approval, because asylum officers get rated. There's like a scorecard rating that they get, and their yearly sort of a grade or analysis depends on this kind of thing. And every time a case gets sent back to an officer because the supervisor disagrees with it, it hurts your grade. It hurts your overall grade. And that can keep you from getting promoted. It can keep you from getting a bonus. So, people want to make their supervisor happy. And a lot of supervisors are anti-immigrant, or at least super strict and err on the side of denying, or are super, super suspicious and think there's fraud everywhere, which we're going to talk more about in a second. So that's the first reason. Number two is the asylum officers are biased, basically, is what this says. And the report is interesting on this. It talks about how people that don't speak English at their interview tend to get denied at much higher rates. There's a bias towards English speakers. And also there's racism. I mean, there's, in my opinion, there's like no way around it. People from Africa and the Middle East especially have a hard time. I think that most of them go in with a strike against them because there's this culture in the asylum office. And of course, not everyone's like this, but I've seen a lot of officers, both when I worked there and now as a lawyer. I've seen a lot of officers who you can tell by the way that they make their decisions and handle the interviews, they're biased against people from certain countries that tend to be from the Middle East or South Asia and Africa mainly. And so, that's something that is not good and not fair. And it accounts for higher refusal rates for people from those countries. Okay. And, a lot of officers tend to see fraud in those cases, even where it doesn't exist. And they tend to have these ridiculous security concerns. I mean, hey, I'm all for security. Security checks should be done. They should be done well. We should have a great system for vetting people to keep people here safe. But people use this as an excuse, or they make life hard on applicants by doing unnecessary security-related inquiries that are biased and are unnecessary. So number third reason for the low approval rate in this study, it's burnout and compassion fatigue. Burnout and compassion fatigue. So officers are overworked. They've just got tons of work. And also, when you're hearing these difficult stories all day over and over again, you can get secondary post-traumatic stress disorder, or you can become desensitized to it, to the things people are going through that can make you start to lose empathy, and you can become this sort of, clinical cold robot who is just getting through the work, getting through the work as quickly as possible, and not taking the time to really think about the case in a thoughtful, open way that gives the person a chance, the applicant a chance to really explain themselves. All right, so the fourth reason cited in the study for why approval rates are so low and denial rates are so high at the asylum offices is pressures from time constraints and caseloads, and this incentivizes asylum officers to cut corners. So I've said a couple times that the workload's intense. There's a lot of work. There's too much to do, or at least too much to do really well. Okay, it builds up, and there's a lot of stress. It's a hard job. Being an asylum officer is a hard, stressful job. So what do people do? Well, they cut corners. Okay, they copy and paste. They don't go as deep or as thorough in the interview as they should. So asylum officers are told that they need to faithfully explore all different asylum claims that a person might have, or all the different routes that someone could have to get to asylum. It's on the officer to do that. That's their duty. But officers often don't do that because they're just overwhelmed, and they're like thinking, I just want to get this interview over with. I just want to get on to the next interview, or to get done with my interview so I can write up my assessments, so I can get these cases off my desk. And those time constraints and the pressure from all the work makes you do a job that is not as thorough, not as thoughtful, not as careful as it should be. And so it matters. It makes for poorer decisions, and I think it makes for more denials, because when you're stressed and you have decision fatigue from making these hard decisions all day and doing it under significant pressure, you're more likely to say no. A stressed or confused mind is more likely to say no. And so that's got to affect the approval rate. I totally agree. It's one of the reasons. But this one coming up is, I couldn't agree more. Okay. So the fifth reason for the high rejection rate, referral or denial, technically speaking, and then is what the authors call an inordinate focus on credibility and immaterial peripheral details of a case to find inconsistencies. What is this about? When a person says something that doesn't line up very well with something they said earlier, or with something that's in like their paperwork, their documents, then the officer says, oh, that's an inconsistency. And they have to do what's called a credibility confrontation, where they give you a chance to explain, because maybe you have a reasonable explanation for what seems to be an inconsistency. They'll say, earlier you said X, and now you're saying Y. Those two things are opposites, or those two things don't match up. Can you explain why you've told me two different things about this? They might not put it quite so clearly, but they'll say, earlier you said X, now you said Y. Can you explain the difference, or can you explain this? And the idea is they're supposed to give the applicant a chance, because they might have an actual reasonable explanation. When they explain, the officer goes, oh, I get it. That makes sense. I see. It wasn't really an inconsistency. But what happens is, when this happens 2 or 3 times, the officer can say, oh, there were too many inconsistencies in your case, and therefore you're not credible, and therefore you're denied. And this isn't written anywhere. It's an unwritten rule that they call the rule of 3, that when this happens 3 times, that's enough to be able to say, oh, too many inconsistencies, not credible, denied. Okay. And what they're saying in this study is that this often happens also when it's stuff that is immaterial or peripheral to the case, meaning it doesn't really matter. It could be something that is of no consequence to the case. It could be something just super small, about, for example, how many people attacked you? And they say, I'm not sure. I think it was 7 or 8. And then later they say, yeah, it was like 8 or 9. I'm not sure. Well, that it doesn't really matter, right? It was a group of guys, a group of people who attacked you. And you can't expect the person to necessarily remember this kind of thing always with detail, especially when we're talking about a lot of traumatic events, a lot of people who have PTSD, a lot of people, who are unable to think and remember things as clearly. I mean, the brain science shows us that trauma affects the brain and affects things like memory and ability to call those details. But in any event, it could be stuff that doesn't really have anything to do with the merits or the main point of the case. It can just be little things. even things that are more tangential to the case than the example I gave earlier that really have nothing to do with the case. Well, if you get two or three of those things, sorry, too many inconsistencies, not credible, denied. And this happens all the time. It happens when, including to smart, sophisticated people. It happens to people who have a good case. It happens to people who are telling the truth. Why? Well, sometimes the officer truly believes that the person is lying and they find these inconsistencies, but sometimes it's just an excuse the officer uses. There's some officers who are anti-immigrant, or in a particular case, they've made up their mind they just want to deny someone, and they need a reason to do it. They can't just say, I don't like this applicant, I want to deny them. They have to justify their decision in their assessment that they write, and this is the way they do it very often. Very often it's, too many inconsistencies, not credible. And they often don't really follow the guidelines that USCIS has for how you can use these inconsistencies as a reason to deny someone. They don't follow the rules, the internal policies for doing the credibility confrontation and analysis. But somehow their supervisors still disapprove it anyway, and the case gets finalized. And that's all there is to it. This happened very recently. A guy from Afghanistan hired me after he applied for asylum alone, did not have a lawyer, went to his immigration interview, his asylum interview without a lawyer, and they sent him a notice of intent to deny, saying, we think that you were lying, there was too many inconsistencies, therefore you're not credible, so you're going to be, unless you can convince us otherwise, you're going to be denied. So he hired me to help him with this next phase of trying to write back and explain why he should still get asylum. And I did that, and we lost. They said, sorry, not persuaded, and here's your denial. And they sent a denial. Now, I did a motion to reconsider, which is essentially an appeal. Did you know that you can basically appeal cases at the asylum office? Most people don't know that, but it is possible. It's called a motion to reconsider. There's no form for it. There's no form you fill out. There's no filing fee. You just write a letter addressed to the director of the office. And in most asylum offices, the director theirself does actually review these. And you explain why they're wrong. I mean, I already explained in the rebuttal, in the legal brief that I wrote about in response to the notice of intent to deny, I already explained in painstaking detail how the officer had gotten it wrong and why this guy should get asylum. But the officer didn't agree with me. Apparently their supervisor didn't agree with me, but the director did. The director granted my motion to reconsider. And what happens is they say, we're going to send it now back to the officer for reconsideration, which basically means you can pretty much count on you're going to win, because the director has said you got it wrong, officer and supervisor. So it rarely works. But this case was an example of, in my opinion, what was a really clear-cut case of the officer doing a poor job and not following the law and the rules with regard to this credibility stuff, with these inconsistencies, because that's what they said. But I picked it apart and that argument, and thankfully we had success in getting the director to agree and to grant our motion to reconsider. But yeah, I saw this all the time at the asylum office, these inconsistencies that people use this as an excuse. And as I said earlier, it happens all the time, even to qualified applicants, because the interview is hard. Even if they're not actively trying to trip you up and make you make mistakes, which some of them do, but even if they're not, it's still hard. It's still stressful. It's way harder than what most people expect. And most people don't have any idea what they're getting into when they go to their interview. And so they're overwhelmed and they're stressed and they make little mistakes, or they just don't present themselves well. They don't explain their case well because it's overwhelming. That's why for me, with my clients, one of the most important things we do is the practice interview, where we do everything, a full-scale mock interview, do everything that they're going to experience on the day of the real interview, so they feel like they've been there before. You're more comfortable and confident when you feel like you've done something before, and you know what kind of questions you're going to get, you know how it feels to be in that position, you know what the different procedures for the day are. All this makes it less likely you're going to commit mistakes and more likely that you're going to do a good job of presenting yourself in your case. So for me, that's crucial. And I offer that service of mock interviews to people that hire me after they've already applied. Even if I wasn't your lawyer to start with, we can still help you with this practice interview. if you want to do something that I think is really a key to increasing your chances for success at the asylum office. So that's it. The statistics were kind of wild to me. New York, the highest rejection rate. Wow, shocking. Thanks again to the authors of this report, which again, if you want to try and find it, let's see, what was it called? Lives in Limbo: How the Boston Asylum Office Fails Asylum Seekers. You can Google that and you'll, I imagine, be able to find it. That's it. If you want my help, if you want to see if my law firm can help you, give us a call or check out my webpage, manningasylumlaw.com, and there you can use a link to book a consultation with me, an asylum strategy session where we'll discuss your situation. We'll tell you whether we think we can help you, and if so, exactly how we're going to do that. Okay. So thank you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel, Manning Asylum Law, so you don't miss new tips and content that could help you secure your future in the United States through asylum. Thanks.